Hi, everybody. My name's Lauren, and I'm the technical manager for this session on impacts of COVID-19 on food systems and food security, chaired by Bharati Kulkarni. Thanks for taking part in ANH 2021. We look forward to a robust and interactive session today. A quick reminder that everything you need to access in terms of materials and program for the conference can be found on the ANH Academy website. Before Bharati takes the conversation forward, I have a few technical announcements to ensure that our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. This session will be recorded and posted on the ANH Academy website following the conference. All participants have been muted, but please introduce yourselves using the chat function. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organisation you work with. We encourage you to turn your video on during the session, but if your connection is bad, we recommend turning your video off. Later on, we'll open up the conversation with an interactive Q&A. If you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we'll do our best to raise them during the Q&A at the end. Finally, if at any point you experience technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection. You can always try to reconnect to the session using the same Zoom link. If you have a technical question, you can send me a private message using the chat box in Zoom. So thanks for listening, and over to you, Bharati.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this very important session to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on food systems and food security. My name is Bharati Kulkarni, and I'm a scientist at the National Institute of Nutrition, Hyderabad, India. Some of you would have met me during the 2019 ANH Academy Week. I'm very pleased to chair this panel of 4 promising scientists who have done remarkable work in difficult times to examine the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on food systems and food security. We all know that COVID-19 is a complex crisis which has affected all facets of our life with both immediate as well as long-term impacts. The pandemic had a particularly devastating impact on food systems and nutrition in the low and middle income countries. The scale of the damage is yet to be known fully because some of the aspects of the damage done by the COVID-19 pandemic would be revealed in the years to come. Conducting research to understand the impacts of COVID-19 on food system and food security was especially challenging during the pandemic because of the lockdown related restrictions for data collection and also because of the fear of disease transmission. Several researchers, despite all the difficulties, have used innovative digital tools for data collection. And this data is valuable for us to understand how we can build resilient systems which are resilient in times such as the pandemic, because pandemic is not yet over and there are chances of similar risk in the future. Without further delay, I would like to invite our first speaker today, Prapti Barua. She is from International Food Policy Research Institute based in New Delhi. She would be sharing her presentation on impact of COVID-19, lockdown, and food security among rural women in Nepal. Prapti Barua, please. Over to you.
Thank you, Bharti. I'm just sharing my screen. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I work as a research analyst with IFPRI, and today we'll be discussing about the impact of COVID-19 on food security among women farmers in rural Nepal. This is a co-authored paper with Muzna Alvi. To give you a brief overview of the study, this paper draws from a series of phone surveys that were conducted in Nepal to understand the gendered impact of COVID-19 among poor and vulnerable groups. The study was funded by USAID and was implemented in partnership with Institute for Integrated Development Studies in Nepal. Just to talk briefly about the COVID timeline and the study timeline, the first case of COVID in Nepal was reported around late January, following which there was a strict lockdown which was announced towards the later part of March. The lockdown was gradually relaxed since early September 2020. We use panel data from 4 data collection rounds implemented during various stages of the lockdown. The first round was conducted in July, second in September, third in November, and fourth was in early 2021. The study was carried out through phone surveys among rural households in 4 municipalities in Dang, which is a district located in Midwestern Nepal in Province 5, bordering India. The sample is not nationally representative since it was only carried out in one district. The sample was drawn using systematic random sampling from a large representative household listing survey that we had conducted in early 2020 for another project on agriculture extension. The overall sample includes both male and female, and 70% of them are women. But for this paper, we report findings for only 421 female respondents who were surveyed across all 4 rounds. We use logistic regression to look at how factors such as income loss and health shocks are related to food insecurity and a woman's achievement of minimally adequate diet diversity. We control for individual and household level characteristics and use a random effects model. We also look at the relationship between food insecurity, dietary diversity, and emotional well-being. Now we'll look at some of the respondent and household characteristics. I'll be rushing a bit through the following slides in the interest of time, but I'll be happy to take it up later if there are any questions around this. So this slide outlines our respondent characteristics. It highlights that almost 90% women were members of community-based groups. Agriculture was the primary occupation for most respondents, while a higher proportion of spouses were employed in the non-farm sector. Due to the lockdown, those working as casual labor, wage labor, or salaried employees had suffered the most. Nearly all households owned land and livestock. Male out migration is very prevalent in Nepal. This is within Nepal as well as abroad. Looking at the economic implications of the lockdown as well as its impact on food security during this period, at the beginning, we see that as much as 85% households had suffered income loss due to COVID. This is reduced significantly with the easing of lockdown restrictions and it's around 45% in the later rounds. Use of savings and borrowing money were the most commonly used coping mechanisms. Less than 5% households received government transfers during this period to deal with income loss. There was also an increase in households that sold assets in later rounds, which might indicate more severe financial stress in the later rounds. Food insecurity was assessed using a modified version of FAO's Food Insecurity Experience Scale for the 2 weeks preceding the survey. A high proportion of women were worried about not having enough food, not being able to eat healthy and nutritious food, and perceived a change in their food access, mostly in terms of being unable to obtain enough food, having to get food from sources that are different from the usual sources, and eating less food than they usually do. Also comparing it with men, we see that women were generally more likely to worry about food insecurity. However, we've not included findings for men in this presentation. Minimum dietary diversity for women, or MDD, was calculated based on a 24-hour recall period for 10 food groups. Around 40 to 42% women in the first 2 rounds of the survey did not achieve MDD. By round 4, while this had declined, more than 1/3 women still continued to have inadequate dietary diversity. Consumption of protein and vitamin B12 rich foods remained low. Here we are defining food insecurity as having to worry about not having enough food to eat in the past 2 weeks. The odds of facing food insecurity was lower among women belonging to households that were economically better off, households that owned land, and that had migrant members. It was also lower for women who were part of community-based groups. To highlight the impact of the pandemic on food security, we see that women from households who suffered income loss due to the lockdown and those who borrowed money to cope with this loss had higher odds of facing food insecurity. Women belonging to households that reported sickness in the week preceding the survey had higher odds of facing food insecurity. Moreover, the results also indicate that women continue to be largely dependent on their spouse's income. The spouse's occupation and whether they have been able to find work plays an important role in determining their food security. For women whose spouses worked as salaried employee or were self-employed, the odds of facing food insecurity was lower as compared to those who were engaged in farming. Women whose spouses did not work had higher odds of facing food insecurity. On the other hand, the odds of facing food insecurity for women who themselves worked as casual labor was higher as compared to women who were involved in farming. Women from, sorry, I think I missed a slide. Yeah. Women from economically better off households had higher odds of achieving MDD. Women from households that suffered income loss due to the pandemic and those who borrowed money to cope with this loss also had lesser odds of achieving MDD. Dietary diversity is also closely related with spouses' occupation, but not their own occupation. Women whose spouses worked as casual labor had lower odds of achieving MDD as compared to those who were involved in farming, while women whose spouses were engaged in productive work in the past week had higher odds of achieving dietary diversity. We also administered the Center of Epidemiologic Studies depression scale to assess depressive symptoms among our respondents. This consists of 20 statements about how they experience different indicators of stress or depression in the week preceding the survey. The possible range of scores is between 0 to 60, with higher scores indicating the presence of more depressive symptoms. An individual is said to be suffering from probable depression if their score is 16 or above. And going by this definition, we see that around 23% women in round 3 were suffering from probable depression, which reduces marginally to about 19% in round 4. Looking at the relationship between food insecurity, dietary diversity, and emotional well-being among women, we see that greater food insecurity was associated with higher odds of suffering from depression, whereas achieving MTD was associated with lower odds of suffering from depression. To conclude with some thoughts on what needs to be done, we observe that food insecurity in various forms was experienced by households in Nepal through various stages of the lockdown, and it may be an important determinant of physical and emotional well-being. Food insecurity and dietary diversity are associated with household economic conditions, and therefore there is a strong need to focus on building economic resilience of vulnerable households, along with providing relief for income shocks and food insecurity challenges. These may include food relief, credit provision, and asset building programs. These programs should also focus more on women, given that the implications are more severe for them and they're still largely dependent on their spouses, as we've seen in our data. Nutrition and psychological counseling support for women also emerged to be of critical importance to promote health and well-being. And for this, women-focused collectives can help improve women's access to resources such as credit and social capital, as well as serve as a crucial platform to deliver counseling services. These are some of the things broadly which can help improve food security and dietary diversity, which in turn can help enhance emotional and physical well-being. With this, I'd like to conclude. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you very much, Shakti, and you have highlighted some of the very important issues that 1 in 4 women were suffering from depression, and there is a need for emotional as well as psychological counseling apart from other government aid. Thank you so much. I now invite the next speaker, Arshad Pal. Arshad Pal will speak on food system disruption, initial livelihood and dietary effects of COVID-19 on vegetable producers in India. Arshad Pal is from World Vegetable Center and he's currently based in Hyderabad. Over to you, Arshad.
Thank you, Bharti. Is the presentation visible?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So yeah, it's my pleasure to be here and present in front of you. So my name is Arshad Pal. I am a post-harvest specialist at World Vegetable Center based in India, and I'm presenting on behalf of the study team today. I am sure you all are aware of the HLP food system framework, which illustrates how food systems affect diets, livelihood, and other environmental, social, and economic issues. I will use this to illustrate the theoretical impacts of COVID-19 on food systems that previous literature and observations have suggested before our study. Sickness is the first thing we think about COVID-19, but actually lockdowns are the things that disrupt agriculture the most, and these were policy decisions. Certain logistical issues from lockdown disrupted key inputs such as access to seed. Labor was also limited because people could not move around for seasonal harvest labor. Transport is, if the people were able to produce, transporting goods to market was disrupted. Availability of the vegetables in the market and stores was therefore disrupted. Prices were volatile at the same time for sellers and consumers. Affordability reduced partly because the prices, but largely because people were losing jobs and income. Shifting demand towards cheaper foods, non-perishable foods, and comfort foods all had the potential to change the diets. Food waste was another potential outcome, particularly for the vegetables, as they are so perishable. Then, of course, all of this has an impact on livelihood of the people working across the food systems from seed to fork. So these are the theoretical impacts that COVID might have on food systems from the literature and from initial observations, but we wanted to research that actually were the impacts in practice. We undertook this research in India. India reported its first COVID-19 case on 30th January 2020, and the first phase of lockdown was started on 24th of March 2020 with almost complete shutdown all services and factories. The lockdown coincided with the peak harvest of dry winter season fruits and vegetables in many parts of the country. Furthermore, the government has also segregated all the districts in the country into red, yellow, and green zones. Agriculture work was largely allowed to continue, except in containment zones. However, transport was not properly functional. Study was conducted between 5th and 12th May 2020 during third phase of the national lockdown. The study was undertaken with the farmers engaged in the existing, forthcoming, and recently concluded project in the world states, Jharkhand, Assam, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka. The target farmers were growing multiple vegetables. The study used a phone-based survey method. Phone-based interviews were necessary because it was not possible to visit farmers in person. Responses were recorded in real time using a customized smartphone application, Aquaflow. We aimed to limit the interviews for 15 minutes and therefore included only 25 questions in the survey. These covered the questions on production, wastage, question on price, sales, and farm income, and question on diets. We also collected some basic farm and household data in order to compare farm and household on proxies for key socioeconomic issues. The analytical samples had observation at 448 farmers. Descriptive analysis were undertaken for each topic, with particular section also analyzed by gender, farm size, understanding heterogeneous effects. Across our survey, quarter of the farmers were women. This was driven by the project in Jharkhand, where half of the respondents were women, while in very few farmers were women, 0 to 6%. Jharkhand also has much small farm size, average 0.8 hectare compared to 1.5 to 3 hectare farmers in other 3 states. Overall, 87% of the farmers reported disruption in production, 79% to sales, and 62% to diets. Figure in the right shows the main vegetables produced by each farmer, to which questions on production, sales, and price related were asked. A large number of farmers, 87%, reported disruption in the production. Most reported that prices were too low to continue with production, 69%, or that they could not find buyers, 65%. Of the problems associated with production, most cited lack of transport, 61%, many cited lack of inputs, 39%, lack of harvest labor, 32%, and some cited lack of storage, 12%. Women farmers were less likely to suffer from lack of labor, but were more likely to see price as too low. Large farms were more likely to lack of labor and storage, and small farms had difficulty in accessing inputs in particular. A vast majority of the farmers saw decline in vegetable sales, price, and farm income. Over 80% of the farms saw some decline in sales, and over 20% of the farmers saw devastating losses of sales, sold almost nothing, slightly higher among the female farmers and double among the small farmers compared to large. Data not shown in here. Price reduced for over 80% of the farmers, and by more than half for 50% of the farmers. Similarly, farm income dropped by 90% of the farmers, and by more than half for 60% of the farmers. 62% of the households reported disruption in their diets. When we asked them directly, most could protect staple consumption, in this case mostly rice, meaning they mostly protected their ability to eat enough calories. Largest drops were in fruits, fish, meat, eggs category, where around half of the households saw either a small or large reduction in consumption. Vegetable consumption dropped for almost 30% of the households, largely due to cost. But interestingly, vegetable consumption actually increased for 12% of the households as they ate their own produce that they could not sell. These were vegetable farming households, and vegetables were the only food group to see major increase. Lastly, it's not shown in the slide, but our analysis showed that women farmer households were more likely to reduce nutritious foods due to cost. We also asked about the farmer households were coping or trying to mitigate the worst effect of livelihood and diets. Key findings were that women farmers reduced prices more and resorted to borrowing more, and that 60% of the farmers planning to produce less next season as a result of COVID. To maintain income or reduce household losses, farmers said they were finding new markets, including selling door to door, reducing prices, and eating the farm's own produce. To maintain sales or mitigate sales losses, farmers said they were leaving harvest in the field, feeding vegetables to livestock, and sharing vegetables with others. To maintain diets, Households said they were reducing household expenses, eating more own-produced food, buying cheaper foods, and borrowing money. So a lot of changes for these farmers and these households to try to cope with the shock of COVID-19. In summary, COVID lockdowns have impacted diets and livelihood of vegetable farmers. Female farmers appear to be worst hit in India. Similar effects of lockdown policies are being seen elsewhere in India and Ethiopia. Effect depends on context, vegetables grown, farmer characteristics, economics, and market context, which we could not assess. Household and business finds it hard to mitigate the effect of these disruptions. Ability to consume one's own produce may be protective of diets. We hope that our findings will be of use as we try to create policy to support farmers and consumers in their livelihood and diets post-COVID and in advance of other food system shocks that will come. So my colleague Jody Harris could not attend today as she's presenting another parallel session, but you can contact either of us for further information that we don't cover in this Q&A. So thank you so much for
Thank you very much, Arshad. Your findings reveal some of the aspects which we were not thinking. For example, some of the farmers plan to produce less next year. So the impacts of COVID are really going to be like unfolded in the years to come in the ways which we do not visualize currently. Thank you so much for bringing that aspect to the fore. Our next speaker is Mackenzie Clamer. She's from University of Edinburgh, and she's going to tell us about her work, which is titled A Crisis Within a Crisis, the early impacts of COVID-19 on the food security of displaced Syrian farm workers. Mackenzie, please.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Hi, so my name is Mackenzie, and I'm a research assistant at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. And today I'll be talking about the impacts of the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic on the food security of displaced Syrian farm workers in 5 countries in the Middle East. I don't know why my slides are changing. Okay, so this research forms part of a larger project called From the Field, which ran from April through July of 2020. And the study was carried out by the One Health Field Network at the University of Edinburgh. We conducted the research remotely in 5 countries: in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and in the opposition-held parts of northern Syria. The project sought to understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on displaced Syrian agricultural workers. And we chose to focus on this group as both humanitarian and development actors have deemed Syrian refugees as highly vulnerable to both the health and economic effects of the pandemic. Syrian farm workers in the Middle East are doubly vulnerable. They're politically vulnerable as refugees in host countries which are not party to the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees, and they're also economically vulnerable because of their position as workers in the informal agricultural economy with a lack of labor rights as well as other social protections. I've called this presentation a crisis within a crisis, as Syrian farm workers were highly impoverished and food insecure even before the pandemic began. So I'll just talk quickly about our methodology. So given that our team wasn't able to travel, we used a set of remote research tools. First, we conducted household surveys with 20 Syrian participants in each of the 5 study countries over WhatsApp. We also piloted a type of remote visual ethnography, which we called digital food diaries. And this involved asking participants to send us photos and videos of their food and what they were eating, consuming, and purchasing over a number of days. The rich visual material that we received really provided deep insights into lived experiences of food insecurity, helped complement the quantitative questionnaire, and also gave agency to participants to really contribute to the research. However, I'll just note that what we could learn from this remote method was limited by cultural norms around privacy as well as gender norms. Participant recruitment and data collection were done by our Syrian, Lebanese, and Jordanian colleagues in the Middle East. And since we wanted to collect household level data, we mostly spoke to male heads of household. All participants in our study worked in food production, mostly as seasonal agricultural workers, and they live largely outside of official refugee camps and internally displaced persons camps. And this means that their ability to access institutional aid was often limited. The study, of course, has a number of limitations. It's a small sample size. We used purposive sampling, and we also had a lack of food security baseline data from before the pandemic. The first main finding from our study is that while no participants that we spoke to had yet fallen ill with COVID-19, the economic domino effects of the pandemic quickly disrupted their agricultural livelihoods and drastically increased food insecurity for Syrian farm workers. Contrary to early predictions, we found that COVID-19 mitigation policies actually didn't have a significant impact on food availability in the communities we surveyed. However, the pandemic had a particularly devastating effect on Syrian households' ability to afford food. In particular, lockdowns and movement restrictions, as well as impacts on agricultural producers, such as rising prices for farm inputs and an inability to find markets for crops, resulted in 2/3 of the Syrians in our study working less hours in agriculture than usual. Many Syrian families therefore saw drastic decreases to their incomes. In addition, food prices in these countries reached record high levels in the early months of the pandemic. 90% of our participants noted increased food prices in their areas, and this is concerning as most participants are highly dependent on markets for their food, even though they work in agriculture. Rising food prices were a particular concern in Lebanon and in Syria, which had already been experiencing economic crises before the pandemic. And indeed, it's really hard to parse out what were impacts from the pandemic versus just further disintegration of ongoing economic crises in these conflict affected areas. As a result, many Syrian households were forced to alter their diets, both in terms of quantity and nutritional quality. The photo on this slide is from a food diary sent to us by a father in Lebanon. Having lost his job and without being registered with the UNHCR, his family has been unable to obtain financial support during the pandemic and had been forced to simplify their diet and reduce portion sizes. So the photo you see here, it's a plate of bulgur and yogurt. That was all his family of 5 was eating for dinner that night. Second of all, lacking financial safety nets, we saw that displaced Syrian households were forced to quickly rely on a variety of negative livelihood coping strategies, as illustrated by the figure on this slide. Most frequently, households first responded to increased food insecurity by drastically changing their food consumption patterns. So they often relied on cheaper foods, they decreased their consumption of meats and vegetables and fruits, and ate more staples such as lentils and bulgur, and were also limiting their portion sizes at mealtimes. We also noted a high reliance on purchasing food on credit or taking out loans to afford food. And this is concerning as displaced Syrian families were already highly indebted even before the pandemic began. We also saw a limited ability of Syrian farm workers to draw on social safety nets such as remittances. In our sample, only 25% of respondents, and this was mostly respondents still within northern Syria, received remittances. And in fact, most of the Syrian farm workers in our study are senders of remittances to families still back in Syria rather than receivers of remittances. Participants in our study also received a lack of support from UNHCR and other NGOs during the pandemic. Only 23% said that they had received food assistance in the past week. I'll just conclude with a few points. First, that for displaced Syrian farm workers, the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic were primarily a food crisis rather than a health crisis. Families quickly experienced increased food insecurity as food prices rose while working hours and incomes decreased. These findings are particularly concerning as this was just the first couple months of the pandemic, and now the pandemic's gone on for more than a year. However, we know from research that our team did in the winter of 2020 and into 2021 that this job loss was just temporary for most Syrian farm workers who have mostly been able to go back to work in some capacity. However, they're still working less than before, and food insecurity remains a persistent issue. Another important finding of the study, which many of my colleagues on this presentation have already observed, is that while COVID-19 mitigation measures may have helped halt the spread of the virus in these countries, such policies can have devastating consequences for the livelihoods of vulnerable groups. Policymakers and humanitarian as well as development actors, therefore, need to immediately increase social protections for refugee and migrant agricultural workers, and then also in the long term, be sure to prioritize these groups during future emergencies. Lastly, and I can talk about this more in the question and answer session, but I think remote visual ethnography holds promise as a means of complementing more quantitative food security assessments, particularly when travel to the field is impossible, by really showing lived experiences within participants' particular social and cultural context. Thanks so much for listening. And to learn more about my team's research, you can visit onehealthfieldnetwork.org.
Thank you very much, Mackenzie, for highlighting the fact that COVID-19 was in fact a food crisis rather than health crisis for Syrian farm workers. And your technique of visual ethnography is very, very powerful. Thank you so much. Our last speaker is Nilupa Gunaratna. She's going to present on impact of the COVID-19 pandemic response on food systems, health services, and health-seeking behavior, results from home-based focus group discussions in rural Kenya. Over to Nilupa.
Can you hear me now and see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for that introduction and these really interesting talks. I'm going to echo a lot of those themes. So I'm happy to share this work from Kenya on behalf of colleagues in Kenya and the United States. So the experience in Kenya has been now 3 waves of COVID-19 so far. And what I would like to do is share some experiences from the first wave. When the pandemic came to Kenya, the government took several steps at the national level, imposing a curfew, closing schools and places of worship, restricting movement in various ways, including de-densifying public transport and requiring permits for the movement of food. These measures varied over time. For example, the starting time for the curfew was changed from 7 to 9 p.m. during that first wave. So our goal in this research was to look at and to understand the effects of the pandemic, and importantly, those mitigation strategies on rural communities and households. And we explored this using qualitative phone-based focus group discussions. We used an existing sampling frame of rural communities, which were representative of the major maize agroecologies in Kenya. And we stratified by agroecological zones, which are depicted by these shaded areas on the map, and the distance to major markets, and then randomly sampled 12 communities, which are indicated by the larger dots on this map. And in each community, we identified 3 men and 3 women with farms of varying size, which was a proxy for socioeconomic status. And we conducted these mini focus groups by phone, 24 in total, with an interview guide that explored a range of topics. And so what I'd like to do is organize our findings by describing how the country level mitigation strategies had impact from the regional down to the individual levels. So starting at the regional level, the restrictions led to reduced business, closure of some food markets, especially open air food markets and other establishments. This led to lost formal and especially informal employment, which reduced household incomes and ultimately reduced consumer spending. People who had migrated to urban areas for work no longer had money to send home, and many returned home themselves. And meanwhile, employment was negatively affected in the rural areas as well, especially in the informal sector. Men described difficulty finding casual work. Women especially described loss of income when they could no longer engage in informal food vending and other types of trade. There were diverse effects on food supply chains. Farmers reported disruptions throughout, and many of these disruptions varied based on agroecology or geography, depending on whether planting occurred before or after the restrictions. So farmers who had not yet planted had difficulty accessing programs and services and ended up spending more on seed and other inputs. At the same time, they were facing decreased incomes and limited credit, as well as banks were hesitant to lend given the financial climate. So as one farmer said, not all farmers are in a position to purchase all inputs at once. And in particular, farmers could not afford casual labor or mechanized services. And ultimately, this led to reduced cultivated area and input use, and understandably sparked concerns about lower production. So meanwhile, the cost of the permits for moving food around resulted in increased transportation costs. Many markets were closed, there was a lack of buyers, and farmers who could sell their crop or livestock products often did so at lower prices. And so what happened was local production that couldn't be sold was consumed locally, which also seems to be the experience from India as well. And this provided some temporary buffering. However, non-local foods became less available and higher priced. And so looking at institutional impacts then, moving on, school closures meant the end of school-based programs as well, such as school feeding and others. For example, there were programs in some areas that distributed menstrual products to adolescent girls. Parents experienced stress and worry for multiple reasons. They were concerned about children falling behind academically. Exams were postponed, school fees could not be reimbursed, and they worried about risky behaviors as children and adolescents had more unsupervised time. The mitigation strategies, together with fear of infection and also fear of being put into quarantine and isolation, also affected health systems and services, and it caused some notable changes in health-seeking behaviors. So access to health services was reduced when public facilities closed or cut their services or reduced hours in different ways. Transportation costs increased because of the de-densification of buses. And there were reports of increased prices and stockouts of medicines. And so this led to people in particular foregoing preventative services, especially services for mothers and children. And people with chronic conditions experienced interruptions in care. There's also a movement towards utilizing private over public health facilities. There are many effects at the household level, some of which I've mentioned, but I'll focus on one in particular here, which is household food security. And so, as I mentioned, households experienced increased demand for food and decreased purchasing power. Markets closed or had fewer vendors, and increased transportation costs also limited access for consumers, who were also afraid of becoming ill from COVID. So all of these factors contributed to household food insecurity, and people coped in a variety of ways. For example, eating smaller meals or skipping them altogether. Again, the local production that could not be sold was consumed at home and sometimes shared with neighbors. So that provided some temporary buffering of dietary quality. However, by the same token, families who were supporting more distant family were unable to do so. The changes also had consequences at an individual level that affected psychosocial well-being. Men and women both experienced stress and worry as they were trying to provide for families with fewer resources, and also with less social support because the mitigation measures and fear of infection reduced social interaction. Additionally, mothers mentioned extra workload as children were home, that they required supervision, and more meals that needed to be prepared. And preparing and feeding these meals caused a special stress, especially in the face of food insecurity. In some households, these added stressors led to conflict and sometimes even violence, often directed towards women. So just to summarize very quickly, in conclusion, the first wave of mitigation measures disrupted food systems in multiple ways in rural Kenya, increasing household food insecurity. And longer term effects are possible. For example, if farmers change their production decisions or practices, or if the need for income drives those farmers to sell early at lower prices. The mitigation measures also cause changes in health services and health-seeking behaviors, with implications particularly for maternal and child health and for chronic diseases. We saw a difference in experiences between among women and adolescent girls compared to their male counterparts, and that demonstrates the value of gender disaggregation at all ages. And finally, as this pandemic continues and it's by no means over, these various mitigation measures remain largely in effect. And so we find that it is feasible to conduct qualitative research remotely and that it can provide valuable insights. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to discussing more of this with you in the Q&A.
So much, Nilufa. You highlighted very well. Is there an echo?
Yes, there is a little echo on your sound.
Yeah, I don't know why it was not there. Sorry about it. Thank you so much, Nilufa. You highlighted the varied impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on consumption, production decisions, access to health services, health-seeking behavior. It's actually such devastating impact on so many aspects, and we will be seeing the impacts on the nutritional status in the years to come. Thank you so much for highlighting the fact that qualitative research can still be conducted remotely, and it will help in developing strategies for resilient systems. Thank you so much. So now we have some time for question answers, and we have the questions in our chat box. So Jasmine has asked a question to Prapti, and it's a very interesting question. The low risk of food insecurity in households with migrant members was interesting. Might this have to do with the levels of pre-COVID resources through remittances, or do you have other thoughts on what might drive this association? Prapti, would you like to take that question?
Yeah. Thank you, Jasmine, for the question. Yeah. Yes, so migration, like income from remittances is a major source of income in Nepal, and especially in rural areas. And they're often, they usually migrate to these Middle Eastern countries or even India for that matter, and these provide them better earning opportunities. So in that sense, they're relatively more economically better off, which may have provided them that initial cushion of dealing with such a shock. But now with the second wave, and now again, like with this pandemic looking like it's going to continue, that cushion is gradually going to, decrease. So it would be interesting to see those impacts. We're planning a 5th round next month. So I think that'll be interesting to understand, given that a lot of migrant workers have returned and they've not been able to go back. So yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, and that is the primary explanation.
Yeah, thank you, Prapti. Next question is to Arshad from Kritika, who has asked that your slide on changes in the vegetable production had some interesting crop choices. If information was collected, can you explain how the crop choice was different from pre-pandemic situation, and why these crops were chosen? Arshad?
Thank you so much, Kritika, for the question. It's very interesting question. So actually, as I mentioned in the presentation as well, because the farmers were the vegetable farmers, and the vegetables are the perishable foods. So they were there because losses were there because they cannot store it for long, and the farmers actually they decided to go for the staple foods, probably the agriculture. They want to the grains because they can store that for a long time. As I mentioned, even the staple food in the rice. So that was important. I think that is the main reason they tried to go to the foods which actually, if there is a pandemic, there is a lockdown, so that will not spoil. So they can store it for some time. I think that is the major reason. So they choose it to those agriculture crops compared to those of vegetables and fruits.
Yeah, thank you, Arshad. Next question is for Mackenzie from Philip, Harriet, and I think 2-3 people have asked this question. 1 minute, I think I'm losing a track of it. Sorry about it. I was seeing it. I'm not able to see that now. Yeah, sorry. Very interested in how focus group discussions are held over the phone. Please, could you give us more details on how that worked and any tips for people planning them? Even I had that query. So thank you for asking this question. Mackenzie, please.
Yeah, sure. So all of the WhatsApp interviews were done by our Middle Eastern colleagues, and most of them were themselves Syrian refugees who are also agricultural scientists. So they're both researchers and also refugees from Syrian communities. And for us, it was really crucial that that the people who had that frontline contact, the direct contact with our participants, were from those communities. I think when you're conducting research via WhatsApp, you don't have the chance necessarily to establish that personal connection and those relationships of trust as easily. And we also know that refugees are a demographic that are often surveyed in rapid needs assessments by a variety of NGOs and development providers. So we know that there's also some research fatigue within this community. So first, it was really important for us to use have our Syrian colleagues be the ones doing this research themselves. Consent was also really difficult because Syrian farm workers might not be literate. And so we used recordings. All of this was done in Syrian Arabic, recordings before the surveys explaining all about the study. It was a very staggered consent process, sending written explanation, consent forms, but also recordings. The food diaries were also particularly challenging to explain to participants, as we were asking for photos of their food, and this seemed very strange within their cultural context. They didn't understand what we were going to do with it. But I think using having our Syrian colleagues be the ones explaining and really establishing that relationship over WhatsApp was helpful. I can talk more about specifics. I think most people had questions about methodology for me.
Yes. Yeah, I think if you can elaborate further, if you would like, that will be helpful. I also have one question about the people sending photos of the food, because many times when people have to send the photos, they want to show that they are embarrassed that they have very little. So sometimes, like, they'll show the best possible. So did you come across such a possibility?
Yes, and someone, I think it was Jasmine, asked me if we've published a methods paper based on this research, and we haven't yet, though we have one in progress. And the lens that we are using in writing that paper is really looking at Syrian hospitality and cultural norms, because what we found was that even though we weren't physically in person with these participants, as you say, participants wanted to show us the best. They wanted to invite us into their homes as guests. And that means showing a very highly curated image of their daily lives and their family lives, and then also hiding certain aspects that they were embarrassed to share with us. And so we found, for instance, that some participants would show us these elaborate meals, meat and barbecue and all of this stuff. And then we would read the questionnaire responses from the same participant, and we would see very high rates of food insecurity, of skipping meals, of not being able to afford meats and vegetables. So we realized they were in some cases probably borrowing money from family and friends to be able to even present that meal to us. And that was definitely difficult. And we might not even have realized this was the case had we not had Syrian researchers on our team who knew the cultural context and knew these norms, cultural norms around hospitality existed. Of course, it means that, what we can learn from remote visual ethnography is partial. I mean, but any data collection method, even in person, is going to be partial. We can't say that any are fully objective. I think, ideally, of course, for a food security assessment or ethnography, being in person is really crucial. But in a pandemic, I think we did still learn a lot about food security from this method.
Yeah, I understand. We have a couple more questions. Rajini, she's asking, what can we do to mitigate these effects of COVID-19 on women and children in the context of the survey setting? She has asked for Nilupa, but I guess it's applicable to all the settings. So Nilupa, please, and then anyone else wants to add, they're welcome to do so.
Great. In terms of women and children, yeah, I don't think I have a satisfying answer. These challenges, continue at varying degrees as restrictions are strengthened and lifted and strengthened again. There were services and safety nets that did exist with variable penetration and application even before the pandemic. So and those were even further reduced. And so without those kinds of safety nets, without that outreach through health centers and so on, and with instruction interrupted and in-person instruction not possible, there are not too many options. So it's really through the average of safety nets and services and institutions that are there with those restrictions in mind. It's an unsatisfying situation.
Thank you, Nilupa. It's difficult to answer for anyone. Anyone else would like to add, Prapti or Arshad?
Yeah, I think I echo completely with what Nilupa just shared. But yeah, like another thing that we can which has been done largely in the South Asian region is the use of collectives. So women collectives, like in Nepal, we have seen that people who are part of these collectives have access to better social safety nets. So I think if we can use that power and collectivization of women, and it also helps them diversify their livelihoods to some extent. So I think that's one thing that we really can build upon going forward.
Yeah, that's very important, because we have seen that women's collectives gather together for economic activities, but then they are used as channels of spreading the messages on food and nutrition, as well as health-seeking behavior. And people have found variable results. Like some studies have found that these groups can be used for improving, for nutritional gains. On the other hand, some groups have found that they come together for economic activities and they may not be interested. But I think it's quite important, and it becomes all the more important in conditions such as pandemic, where social networks and support, community support is quite crucial. Thank you so much for that. I think we have finished the questions in the chat box. Lauren, you want to?
I think Bharati, there are two more questions, I think.
Yeah, there are a couple more questions at the top.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not able to navigate. Okay, let me do it once again. So yeah, one question Ankita has asked, could you please, to Arshad, could you please share some examples of cheaper alternatives chosen by the households to cope with the COVID pandemic? And another question, okay, I think I'll let you answer this first and then ask the next question.
So thank you so much for Ankita for this question. So I think as the immediate remedy, the farmers, they mentioned that they reduced the household expenses overall. So they tried to reduce the expenses what they were doing, and they tried to eat own food what they were producing. So what they were even purchasing, but they were dependent from market, and they tried to avoid it. So, and they moved to eat more staples compared to they might be eating some meat, or they might be eating vegetables or fruit. So they just tried to move to the staples to eat, so that will be much cheaper for them. And even they tried to buy the cheaper foods which were available around. And some also mentioned, so they borrowed money from their relatives or friends. I think these were the immediate remedies what they mentioned for this, for coping up the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Arshad. Second question from Ankita: what do you feel are the reasons why women suffer more? Could the men in the study adapt certain mechanisms to avoid greater losses?
Yeah, so thank you, Ankita, again. So in this case, actually, the women, they were different, because women, we found that they had small farm size. Although for the labor was not the issue for them to harvest, but their harvest was very small. And men, actually, they tried even to sell to the nearby markets, or they'd go to door. But for women, it was not possible. Number one, the quantity of harvest, what they harvested was very less. And number two, for them, it was difficult to move around and just to try to go, because the male farmers tried to move, they might even go to door, etc. That's the reason the women suffer more. And even when their income was less, they were not able to sell. And at the end of the day, even the foods they were eating, even the nutritious foods, the nutrition, what foods to the family was eating. So for women farmers, I think they also reduced the consumption as well. Because of the result, they were not able to sell their produce, what they produced in the farm.
Yeah, thank you, Arshad, for that. There's one more question from Harriet to Nilupa. Sorry. Yeah, so Harriet wants to know, she's asking Nilupa, could you please talk a bit more about the phone focus group discussion? What were some of the challenges you experienced, for example, network problems, etc.? Did the facilitator have any challenges, considering that he or she couldn't see the participants? Nilupa, please.
Sure, thanks for that. Yes, we were not sure how that whole process would go, working by phone. The focus groups were not typical. There were many. We had 3 respondents. So the whole call, and it was just a regular mobile conference type call on people's mobiles, where there are 5 people. So we had our facilitator, We had another kind of assistant, someone who was taking notes as well. The sessions were recorded, the audio was recorded, the consent was given verbally. So what we would do is we had our 3 participants, we would contact them ahead of time, one-on-one, go through some of the consent process with them when we were working with them individually, schedule a time, and then we would have the session of 5 with the 3 respondents, the facilitator and the note taker. We would repeat the oral consent again, and then have the conversation. And yes, there was, of course, those issues of connectivity, of calls dropping. It was not too bad in that sense. You would have people taking calls outside, so there's the sound of wind and so on. I mean, I think it's never ideal when you can't have the visual interaction, but we certainly didn't have the bandwidth for that. We did send credit for participation to make up for the cost that they have. I think one of the main challenges was especially accommodating the female focus groups, just because of the demands on the women's time. The men could meet in the morning or really whenever. The women needed their mornings to do farm work, to do work with children, to prepare a meal for the kids. So we had to do those in the afternoon or just be more flexible with those. But that was important in terms of experience.
Thank you, Nilupa. I think people were interested in the methodology and we had a lot of questions on methodology. I think we have done with the questions in the chat box. Lauren, you want to open for participants to?
Yes, I've changed the settings so that you can unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask a verbal question.
Yeah, I would encourage all our attendees to ask questions or give comments or give their experiences, because this is quite a difficult situation. And as Nilupa said, there are no answers to it, how we can build systems which are resilient and what strategy should be adopted. So anybody would like to give feedback, they're welcome to unmute themselves and give their feedback. Thank you. Yeah, you can raise your hands so that you can be unmuted.
I'm wondering if I may ask a question of my colleagues.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so many of us are reporting results from like really the first experience, which was the first wave or the first lockdowns. And that was really quite a shock. And the crisis is just dragging out in so many of our countries. And so I'm wondering if others are conducting research on the experience now and how it differs from that initial shock.
Yeah, in Nepal, I'm just going first. In Nepal, we are planning. So if you notice, our first round was in July. In fact, actually, we're doing a similar survey in India as well. So now we're again having the second round of survey. It's starting next week in July. So this will be exactly a year. So this will kind of get a better sense of the previous figures. Like we can draw a comparison with last year. Also, having said, like India and Nepal went through massive, like very devastating second wave of infections. So yeah, I think like the next round is going to provide more insights.
Yeah, so Nilupa, yeah, thanks. Actually, we have also done, because there was a recent lockdown in several states in India as well. So as well as in the states where we had targeted this. So we also did a follow-up survey for the same. So how it changed. But we have just completed the data collection. I think we will going to analyze, and very soon we will come up with another publication. But how? Because we contacted those farmers again. So because the lockdown was there as well, so we tried to contact them and see what is the difference. So, but data collected, and we will be coming up with the paper on that as well.
Yes, in our study, we also, as I mentioned in my presentation, did a follow-up survey in November through, I think, January. And what we did in addition to doing a second survey with the participants was we also tried to talk to other important actors within the supply chain. So we talked to their agricultural employers as well as agriculture intermediaries who are often involved in sort of mediating between employers and helping migrant farm workers find work in the Middle East. And we thought that adding those two different interview groups really helped provide a fuller picture of food system level dynamics and helping to really understand what were the dynamics that were causing Syrian refugee farm workers to lose their jobs, and got a much better understanding of the agricultural side of the price increases for inputs and the difficulty with finding markets, etc.
Yeah. We have another comment from Mackenzie about Syrian women who were much more comfortable to speak to female researchers, and women were also likely to share, less likely to share visual data, for example, photos and videos, due to cultural norms around modesty and privacy. So I think there are huge challenges in conducting remote research, and these gendered aspects also need to be taken into consideration. So, but does it influence your results because women are less likely to share data?
Yeah, I think it does. And I mean, women were a smaller portion of our sample size anyway, just because we were targeting the household level, and most Syrian households are headed by men. It was interesting though, I think when you're looking at ethnographic data, it's sometimes less about quantity and more about quality. And even though we did receive fewer digital food diaries from women, the ones that we did receive from women were some of the most fantastic ones. I think they really spent a lot of time and effort into showing us their homes and aspects of their food insecurity. So for instance, men were more likely to actually like take a selfie and speak to us on a video and take us on a tour and, really narrate everything. And women usually were not physically present in the videos. A couple of them were, but usually they were silent and they would just take video or photos, but they were really thoughtful in how they curated and showed different aspects of home life and of children, and of how they went to the market and how they prepared food and their families eating. So I think the quantity might not have been there to do like a gendered comparison, but I think we got really high quality digital ethnographic data from women. And we also found in the surveys in general that women gave really high quality responses.
Fine, thank you. Nilufa?
Hello, can I come in? This is Rajni.
Yeah. Yes, Rajani, go on.
So since we have now some data or some information on how various groups, especially women and children, were affected due to the effect of COVID-19, I know some measures were taken by everyone, the respective state government or or as somebody said, some NGOs or the international NGOs were trying to help or provide some safety net of the food supplements or etc. So do we have any data on how, what was the effect of these interventions, or how effectively we could mitigate, or how much was the the coverage? And probably this is something where we don't have much time. We will have to act, and if we have to genuinely help these people and have some understanding of what best, what will be the best way to help those who are suffering. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rajani. I think that's quite important because I know about India, the government was very proactive, and because the supplementary nutrition centers, which are called Anganwadi centers, where children and pregnant women gather for food supplements, because they could not function, the government immediately implemented take-home rations. So food was delivered to the doorsteps of people. So Rajani's question is whether the reach or impact of these interventions was assessed in any of the studies. Prapti or Nilupa, anyone? would like to come in?
No, not yet. We're planning to do it in the next round, but yeah, not yet.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Bhati. I would like to say that we did a small study in a remote district in South India. We did ask them about the government schemes reaching them during lockdown, and people have reported that they did receive ration during the lockdown, and that helped them a lot in terms of elevating food insecurity. And also, even post-lockdown, they continue to receive the ration. I think this wave also government has declared up to September continuous supply of ration irrespective of their Aadhaar card linkage and other things. So I think that's one scheme which we have seen and people have told about it. And other things like giving financial incentives to poor families, account transfer of the money, especially for school children. I think they have done it. A few of them reported that their account, they have received some money per month, some 1,000 rupees or something like that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Patil. I think there are studies we also conducted in Telangana. So there are studies which show, some of them show that people received and some of them showed that there were leakages. So I think these are context specific, but these social safety networks are quite important. Jasmine has her hand up. Jasmine, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, yes, thank you. So my question is really about the research ethics in this particular moment in time. And it strikes me that there's really an ethical imperative to present the voices and the experiences of people who've been affected, but also an ethical imperative not to spread COVID to participants and to keep field workers safe. So I just wondered if any of the panelists would be happy to share how these ethical considerations sort of shaped initial discussions and planning around data collection, and also how that was weighed against data validity concerns in light of these ethical challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine. Would you like to answer, Nilupa or Prapti?
Sure, I can just go first. Yeah, this is something I actually would love to hear a broader idea of, because for us, everything was done by telephone. There was no gathering even of the participants on the other end of the phone. Everyone was in their own home, and it was all done by mobile, and that was to protect, both to minimize any exposure, not just for participants, but also for staff, whom we're all, we're responsible for each other. And that's an ongoing tension. One of my, I guess, concerns though is, we have in the last year also had some really great discussions about equitability and people who are not being able to lend their voices in this. And we're really relying on these digital technologies. And even though we can do things like offer mobile credit and so on, there's still people that we are not reaching and stories that we are not learning. And I don't have a good solution to that doesn't provide, that doesn't result in exposures to staff or to participants. So I would love to hear what others think on that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Nilupa. I think Jasmine's question is very important because phone interviews and digital technology can avoid disease spread and maybe can maintain the biosafety. But there is another dimension of emotional trauma when the questions are asked about the food insecurity. Sometimes it may be embarrassing. Sometimes it's they have to relive the pain. So I think there are many dimensions of ethics here, and because this was probably our first experience, these dimensions will also evolve in future. Prapti, you want to add?
I would.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on, please.
Okay. Yeah, so I was also saying that one of our interesting experience was that when we first started these interviews, especially in India, so we faced this issue that so mostly men own phones in their houses. So they would not pass on the phone to women, and it would be difficult reaching to them. So then, because we were working in partnership with Seva, which really has an on-ground presence in India, so they told us a lot of women, so there were men were not willing to, men were not comfortable letting them speak to others. So then they were asked to participate on the condition that you can turn your speakerphone on so that everybody around can hear what they were saying. So then, and we also had questions on intimate partner violence at that point. So we inserted a question, so but we couldn't directly ask them to not put it on speaker. So we had to insert a question which was kind of like, you know, I'm having some difficulty in hearing you clearly. Is your phone on speaker? If it is, it's no problem. We'll just have to adjust some setting on our phone. Although it's a little misleading, I mean, if you talk about ethics, but then that kind of, and we see that quite a few, like almost 40–50% initially had their phones on speaker. Eventually that figure decreased because it was a panel survey and we contacted them every 2 months, so there was more trust. So I think the speakerphone aspect is another important thing while reaching out to women through remote surveys.
Yeah, I think this is another dimension you have highlighted, and it's quite important.
I'll just quickly add with regard to research ethics to also think about the data collectors involved in the research, as obviously not only were our participants affected by the pandemic, but often our entire research team was as well. And we were working with researchers in the Middle East, and they were doing these interviews over WhatsApp. And it's very difficult, I think, when you give a participant your phone number to kind of know where the research starts and stops. And so often, because Syrian refugees have so many material needs, right? They need food assistance, they need cash-based assistance. Even after the interviews, we found our data collectors were getting lots of messages of like, oh, can you tell me what NGO I can get in touch with to help me find work, or my child needs medication or something like that. It's really difficult as a researcher to respond to that, and created a lot of emotional burden for our data collectors, who of course wanted to be empathetic. We did have sort of a list of resources of, for mental health support, NGOs in the area, et cetera, but it wasn't really, of course, our place to be providing that humanitarian assistance. And so we found in our team that we had to do a lot of check-ins with our data collectors to see how they were doing, to see if they were feeling emotionally overburdened, overworked, because they certainly were fielding a lot of back and forth conversation with participants even after the questionnaire ended.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting the emotional burden, even for the data collectors, because it is quite difficult to collect this data. It's difficult for the participants as well as the data collectors, and psychological support is quite essential. So Lauren has some announcement.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to launch a short feedback poll just to hear your thoughts on today's session. If you could please fill it out. Thank you. And I've posted a couple of bits in the chat about some new initiatives launched by ANH Academy. So please do check those out. We've launched a teaching resources directory and a new mentoring scheme, and we're currently looking for mentors. So please sign up if you're interested. And just to say a huge thank you to the chair, Bharati, and the speakers, and everybody for your questions and participation. It's been a really interesting session. We have some more events happening today. So we have a poster session happening at 3:55 BST. I'll just put a link to that in the chat group. And we also have some social hangouts at the end of the day. So I'll put that also in the chat box for you. Bharati, did you want to say a couple of words to wrap up? You didn't get a chance to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren. I wish to thank all the speakers, Prapti, Arshad, Nilupa, and Mackenzie, for sharing their experiences. It was quite a moving experience to listen to this, and we still don't have answers to it, as we realize, but then we need to keep on this work and try to find solutions. Thank you so much. And I thank the ANH team for an excellent support, which is the hallmark of ANH Academy. And I thank you, ANH Academy, for giving me this opportunity. With this, we can wrap up this session. Thank you all the attendees for being there for more than an hour and making this session very interactive and enriching. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to end the session now. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.